I don't need a man, but if I get pregnant, I demand that the government make sure that the man I had sex with supports the child that he has no legal rights to. I don't need a man, but if I divorce one, I demand that the government give me a portion of his salary for the rest of his life. I don't need a man, but if my ex-husband or ex-lover can't supply enough money for my children and I, then I demand that the taxpayers support us. I don't need a man, but I demand that standards be lowered and incentives be provided so that I can compete with men in any field that I like. I don't need a man, but I demand that I have free childcare and health care for my children. I don't need a man, but I demand to get paid just as much as a man, even if I'm a worse employee. I don't need a man, but I demand maternity leave from my employer. I don't need a man, but I demand that anywhere I go be a safe space where my delicate sensibilities won't be offended by hearing something I don't like. These delicate sensibilities of mine must be protected by any means necessary. Social pressure, university speech codes, hate speech laws, or even the threat of violence from manginas. I don't need a man, but I demand the protection of men in the military, law enforcement, fire department, and of civilian men in general. And I demand that I gain entry into any of the previously mentioned occupations with much lower physical standards. I don't need a man, but I demand that any accusation I make against men be accepted unconditionally by the authorities. I don't need a man, but I demand entry into all male-only spaces, and further demand that the men there must change to accommodate me and my desires. I don't need a man, but I demand medical research and popular concern be focused on my problems, despite men dying sooner than women do. I don't need a man, but I demand free birth control, and I will call it a war on women if someone objects to paying for my reproductive choices. I don't need a man. I just demand that men be forced to provide all the services that they traditionally have in the past, but this time free of charge and with society's contempt instead of accolades.
The road to Title IX begins as all journeys begin with the first step. Bernice "Bunny" Sandler, who everyone considers to be the godmother of Title IX, has just got her doctorate from the University of Maryland and was refused teaching positions that were open because she was a woman. Shaken by those experiences, Bunny turned to what she calls bibliotherapy. Quote, "If something is wrong in my life, I read about it. I didn't know what to do about it, so I started reading about what African Americans did in terms of discrimination in education. I quickly learned that what I thought was immoral did not mean it was illegal. There were no laws at that point that prohibited discrimination in education against women. I was reading a report from the Commission on Civil Rights that mentioned Presidential Executive Order 11246, which prohibited federal contractors from discriminating in federal contracts on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin. There was a footnote, and being an academic, I read it. It said, almost verbatim, this order was amended to cover sex discrimination. I was alone in the house, and I literally screamed. It was a eureka experience. I made the connection that many universities had federal contracts, and if they did, the executive order prohibited sex discrimination. I didn't know what to do with this information, so I called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance at the Department of Labor. The staff connected me to Vincent Macaluso, who had been waiting for someone to notice this amendment. He invited me to come and talk with him, and I was very leery of going. I had never spoken to the director of anything. Nevertheless, I went, and he told me what to do, what kind of information to gather. He told me how to file a complaint, and he gave me strategies to get people to pay attention to it. I was hooked. I decided I was filing charges. At that point, I was connected with WHEEL, the Women's Equity Action League, which was established by Betty Boyer, an attorney in Ohio, because she felt that now was too radical. I became the chair of WHEEL's Federal Action Committee on Contract Compliance. In fact, I was the entire committee. Mr. Macaluso had said that if you have a title, it's better than just signing your name. And if you have a committee title, it looks like it's a bunch of people. So I filed the complaint against the University of Maryland. You didn't need an attorney, and since I decided I wasn't going to have an academic career, I filed in my own name, although not on the behalf of myself. Macaluso told me to gather as much data as I could, even though most people weren't going to read it in great detail. With a lot of data, they would assume that there was some legitimacy to the complaint. I gathered about 80 pages of information. After I filed the complaint against the University of Maryland, my then husband said I should send out a press release. What did I know about press releases? We sent one out, and the Saturday Review of Literature, a magazine for intellectuals, put a small paragraph saying that the charges of sex discrimination were filed against the University of Maryland and every institution in the nation because it was a class action. It said for further information to contact me, and soon I was getting calls from women all around the country. They'd gather data, and I'd file it in my name, using the executive order argument. I would compare the percentage of workers in a department to the percentage of doctorates awarded to women in that field. Here's a pool of qualified people. The percentage of women faculty in the department should represent somewhat the proportion of the pool of qualified candidates. I eventually filed against 250 colleges and universities. She reinforces the important role key policymakers played in creating a federal response to gender discrimination. Quote, when she set up WHEEL, Betty Boyer cleverly managed to get people like Representative Martha Griffiths from Michigan, Representative Shirley Chisholm from New York, and Representative Edith Green from Oregon on the board. Following Mr. Macaluso's advice, I sent complaints to these women and others. I didn't realize how important Edith Green would turn out to be because I didn't know that much about Congress and how it operated. She was the chair of the subcommittee that dealt with higher education and was clearly the right person to get these complaints. She had been thinking of doing something to end sex discrimination for quite a while, but she needed to have a visible constituency. Because we were filing charges, there was now a constituency. She began to draft the Title IX legislation, and then she put the Title IX hearings together. Money said, the Civil Rights Act was important linguistically because it gave us the terms race discrimination and sex discrimination. The Civil Rights Act began to publicly define discrimination. We didn't have the word sexism until about 1973 or 1974. The term sexual harassment and acquaintance rape or date rape came later. There were times in my past when I couldn't understand something or thought something was unfair, but I had no label for it. If you don't have a label for it, like words like sex discrimination, it's hard to think about it. When you start to have names for things, you no longer see it as your particular or individual experience, but how it is now part of a pattern. I didn't use word sex discrimination when I was told I came on too strong for a woman. I didn't use the word sex discrimination when the guy said he didn't like to hire women. I saw these experiences as a series of individual bad things happening, but didn't connect them. Once there was a word for it, everything changes. In July 1970, Representative Edith Green held the first congressional hearings on the education and employment of women, the first step toward creating Title IX. Representative Green developed the first version of a broadly defined bill intended to amend Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, as well as the Equal Pay Act, but honoring requests by African American leaders who worried that this would weaken the Title VI coverage for African American students. Representative Green then proposed Title IX as a separate bill. Representative Green, together with Representative Shirley Chisholm of New York, Representative Patsy Takemoto Mink of Hawaii, Senator Birch Bayh of Illinois, and Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, introduced the bill to Congress. In 1972, Title IX became law, with the words, "No person in the United States shall, on this basis of sex, be excluded from participation under any educational program or activity receiving federal assistance." Although it was attached to a higher education measure, Title IX covered all levels of education. Representative Green and her allies carefully planned how to get the amendment passed without large-scale male attacks. Elementary and secondary education associations paid little attention because the amendment was under higher education. But for the most part, the amendment received little notice. Assured that Title IX would not require educational institutions to allow women to play football, education associations and their congressional supporters passed the bill in June of 1972. It was immediately signed by President Richard Nixon and became law on July 1st, 1972. The broadly defined anti-discrimination language of Title IX provides protection for students and employees, including protection against sexual harassment. It covers education from kindergarten through graduate school and covers administration, recruitment, educational programs, and activity course offerings, and access, counseling, financial aid, employment assistance, facilities and housing, health and maintenance, benefits and services, scholarships and athletics, as well as protection from discrimination against marital and parental status. With such broad coverage, Title IX and the legal requirements to ensure non-discrimination set the stage for dismantling and rebuilding a system that kept women and girls from their full potential and helped change U.S. workplaces, economics, and families. Title IX provided the legal basis for equity, but not the funds for operational support. That came with future legislation, including the Women's Educational Equity Act, Title IV of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Vocational Educational Equity Act, and the Carl D. Perkins Vocational and Technical Education Act, all of which provided funds and support for schools and colleges to implement gender equity changes. Collectively, because these acts offered both technical assistance and, most importantly, money, they reframed education on all levels. Title IX significantly changed the role of women and girls in education and work, and ultimately the role of men and boys as well. It signaled the beginning of changes that slipped from the classroom to the home, to the workplace, and on to all parts of American society. Title IX became the model for the expansion of women's education and employment around the world. Bernice Sandler said, "These are all major changes caused in part by Title IX, and in large measure by the women's movement." Title IX, specifically because it applies to education, gave women a mechanism to foster change. It was the law that changed the culture. This brings up the old question: does law create the culture, or does the culture create the law? I guess it's probably both. The country was ready for sex discrimination laws. Indeed, does the law create the culture, or does the culture create the law? Title IX was the law that created the culture. We've just seen how lawmakers were waiting for an opportunity to pass this particular legislation. Is it a coincidence that the bill was proposed 3 months after Kent State and the student protest? Title IX had no groundswell of protest from women. There were no sit-ins, there were no riots, there were no marches. As Edith Green says, there was no constituency for Title IX and policy of equity. It had to be gathered, and it was gathered accidentally by Bernice Sandler and on purpose by Macaluso. Title IX and its sister, Title X, the law that formed federal Planned Parenthood, are the twin pillars that the foundation of second wave feminism was built on. The connecting laws and legislations along with it created a massive social change and social dynamic between men and women. This policy of equity, formed by these two laws, started a slow and steady process of the dismantling of what was left of Western patriarchy, and started the process of resocializing males and females into this matriarchy that we see today. We cannot underestimate the impact of what Title IX actually had on the society. The long, slow process of masculizing females and slowly feminizing males. It was a long 40-year process from where it started to get where we had today, and a lot of twists and turns along the way. So in the next episode, we'll be delving a little deeper into policy of equity.